Why are there so many podcasts about Tottenham? Do I want to know why? They might contain insight, but mostly delusions. If I hear one more, I might die. They don't like Levy and they don't like Enoch. They pine for Moo and Conte. Someday we'll like 'em, old Tottenham Hotspur, the podcast clout chasers and me.
You're right. Welcome to Tottenham Hotspur, the Spurs podcast about Spurs podcast that apparently has the entire Tottenham Hotspur podosphere on edge. My name's Ian, and I'm recording this podcast on Monday, April 14th, 2025. Yesterday, we got spanked and humiliated by Wolves in the Premier League in a 4-2 loss. Spurs suffered some pretty bad luck, some of their own creation, and some good fortune, which was also of their own creation. So that's fun. And this, we're also a couple days away from facing Frankfurt in the second leg of the Europa League quarterfinals. We played pretty well, I felt, in the first leg, and we'll have to see how things go. So here we are, getting ready to listen to some more podcasts. Before I step into that, I just want to make a quick comment on my last episode, which was centered around the profanity, which is found in multiple Spurs podcasts, which I enjoy. I like a good swear word, don't get me wrong. It's been a real treat to hear the podcast mentioned in places that I didn't expect to hear its name uttered, so thanks for everybody who shared it or talked about it. It was really quite exciting to hear Danny Kelly from The View from the Lane talk about Tottenham Hotspur and how much swearing is taking place in various Spurs pods. So that was really cool. If you like the show, you can follow me at Tottenham Hotspur on Blue Sky. I also now have an email address, tottenhamhotspur@gmail.com, if you want to send me, hate mail. And today I'm going to change up my format. I usually have been talking about a big podcast review I've done first, and then I move on to quick reviews, and this time I'm going to flip it. I'm going to talk about quick reviews first and move into a larger dissection of the Change For Tottenham fan advocacy group's live stream videos. So, as I mentioned earlier, 30 seconds ago, this has been a tough week. We come off the back of a 1-1 draw with Frankfurt in the Europa League. Everyone's feeling pretty good. We step into the Premier League against Wolves and we get slapped 4-2. So I'm in a pretty foul mood, if I'm honest, and so are most of the podcasters. I felt yesterday what I really needed was just some kind of visceral catharsis and just rage, and I didn't quite get the rage, but I did get most of the other points from Jack's Rule the Roost reaction podcast. It was kind of just what I needed coming out of a humiliating loss in the Premier League that has just come after so many others. I identify with the anger that Jack is putting into this podcast. I'm looking forward to his main pod this week to see how he settles down. But I'm annoyed. I'm really annoyed at the players. I'm a little annoyed at Ange Postecoglou. I'm a little annoyed at Daniel Levy. And I don't think I'm alone in that matter. Quite how we construct and use that disappointment and anger is what defines us, though. So on the other side of things, I also gave a quick listen to We Are Tottenham TV's reaction pod. I listened to that today, so perhaps I wasn't quite in the right frame of mind to receive it. And it wasn't quite for me. Fortunately, the podcast was short, and there were two contrasting vibes coming from the two speakers on We Are Tottenham TV. One of anger I felt from the main chap, forgive me, I don't know his name, and the other of mostly exhaustion from his co-host. So if that sounds like something that you might be into, go for it. And I'm quite excited to come back to, or maybe that's an overstatement, but I'm interested in coming back to this show after a big win. I feel like they could be a lot of fun to listen to them get excited about Spurs being good. In other reaction pod news, the Extra Inch had some drama on their Patreon, I'm sad to say. Windy, who has for a while now been quite negative about... Oh, that's unfair. He's felt frustrated about the team and Ange Postecoglou's tactical approaches and didn't feel quite as positive about Spurs' showing against Frankfurt last Thursday as some did. And this prompted howls of contrition, I guess. Is that the right word? Is that a word? From his Patreons who pushed back, and he ended up apologizing in a reaction pod to the reaction pod, which, considering he called my podcast quite meta just a few weeks ago. Sorry, Windy. It's also quite meta to make a reaction pod to your reaction pod. But nevertheless, he had to handle the criticism, and he went into a kind of self-reflective state. I quite like that about Windy. I know others might have concerns or criticisms of how he presents himself, but I do find him to be the type of person who looks outward for information about himself. And he tries to integrate that into his own worldview and approach. And that was on display in the Patreon this week. As for the Wolves game, sadly, Windy... Well, not sadly for Windy, but, he had something good by the sounds of it going on. He couldn't watch the Wolves game in real time, so Bardi handled it, which was just a real fun treat and break from their usual reaction pod standards. So give that a listen. And as for their main pod this week, you know what you're getting with the Extra Inch at this point. It's, tactics, they're all sadly Ange out, I would say. But their defense of Vicario and his role in the goals we conceded against Wolves are worth a listen. Dr. Tottenham was also a decent listen this week. Dan Vass and Billy T, who I'm going to talk a little bit about later, were all on talking about club culture, I would say. That was kind of the main focus of the Dr. Tottenham podcast this week. They used the word malaise in their title and about 100 times in their podcast, and they were examining this malaise from the stands and the fans all the way to the boardroom at Spurs. So that was an interesting soup to nuts take on the club. The Game Is About Glory was good this week. I found them to be quite forgiving on the mistakes that happened in the Wolves game especially. And they were mostly focused on the why of the mistakes, the situations that led to so many unforced errors. But they're mostly worth tuning into this week for their Berival button. I hope I got that right, which was a fun listen. Echoes of Glory was good this week. Tune in for the analysis of goals scored and conceded within the first 10 minutes of Spurs games this season. The Fighting Cock was decent. Flav, Ricky, and Dave. Didn't catch his last name. He's a comedian/actor. He's been part of the Under the Lights comedy movement or comedy tour that takes place for some European games. They lamented the errors that took place in the Wolves game. Are you sensing a trend? And also they've talked again about Spurs family trauma, which I'm not particularly a fan of because sometimes I feel like the Fighting Cock throws out these things and it's quite... I think insensitive to people who actually genuinely do have family trauma. But I understand what they're trying to do. They're trying to sort of take a lighthearted approach to all this crap that Spurs fans are going through at the moment. They did try to find some bright spots in the game, and I felt that Dave made some good points about Arsenal fan cognitive dissonance, which was, anybody who's willing to put the boot in on that lot, I'm welcome and want to listen to. The FTL, View from the Lane. Again, my favourite podcast of the week because they're one of the ones that mentioned my little pod. Nothing unexpected from them after a loss. James Moore was on, Jack Pitbrook, Danny Kelly. I thought they were interesting to listen to this week for the journalist view on the supposed squad leaks of information that are coming out of Tottenham Hotspur that Ange Postecoglou addressed in, I was going to call it a podcast then. I guess I got podcast on the brain. That Ange Postecoglou addressed in a press conference the other day. So that was a good listen. And finally, Come and Discuss Spurs was a welcome breath of fresh air after hours of Tottenham. I don't want to call it misery because everyone's doing their best in putting content in the world, but Stu opened up with a welcome commitment to positivity that he stuck to throughout his podcast, even if his co-hosts were looking to challenge him at some times. And they were looking forward to Frankfurt, not looking backwards to Wolves and the Frankfurt game. So good job, Stu. Good job, lads. I especially enjoyed, I think it was either Austin or Ashley that said that they hadn't watched any of the games, but only highlights, and that they were slightly drunk. So that was the kind of vibe that CADS brought at times, which I found enjoyable. So pods this week, all kind of upset with the state of the world, trying to find any glimpse of joy that they can and hold on to it and not have it taken away. Look for the podcast this week that you think is going to bring you the most joy. If you're looking for somebody to make you feel better, look for that. Somebody who's going to, validate your anger, look for that. Just keep yourself going, practice some self-care, and we'll come out of this the other side. So let's move on to the main podcast review this week. And it's not really a podcast review, but I'm going to treat it like one. I'm going to talk about Change For Tottenham, this fan advocacy group that has absolutely exploded into the Spurs public consciousness in the last few months. And they've been putting out some really interesting live stream videos on Twitter and on Instagram Live and up on YouTube. And so they have a lot of content across various different places, which are somewhat hard to review, and it's hours of content. So I found it a challenge to summarize. In fact, I have something like 13 pages of notes on this topic, so I've really had to distill it down. So from that, if I miss something, it's either because I'm too stupid to have thought about it, or I'm too stupid to recognize it in my notes. So I apologize. Yell at me on Blue Sky. So for background, the Change For Tottenham fan advocacy group or movement, sometimes called CFT, is the latest representation of Tottenham Hotspur supporter distrust and disappointment with their long-term owners, ENIC, the investment group, headed up by current Spurs chairman Daniel Levy, who's been in position for, I think, 24 years. There have been a number of protests, or I'm going to call them fan advocacy groups, even though my mouth can't seem to want to say it out loud properly, over the years at Spurs, going back decades. And they've had varying degrees of success in terms of pushing the club to undergo change. Recently, the ones that I would point to would be the return of the Shelf, Save Our Seniors, the Spurs Charter, of course, the Tottenham Hotspur Supporters Trust, the Fan Advisory Board, but other groups which are more Premier League wide, such as the 20s Plenty campaign, Stop Exploiting Loyalty, and more. So CFT has become the current face of Spurs fan revolt. Their yellow flags and scarves can be seen around the stadiums, Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. It's visible to even somebody like me who has to be a full-time TV fan because of my position here in the United States rather than living in the UK, being able to go to the stadium regularly. You can see these little flashes of yellow. It's quite astounding the impact that they've had in what feels like quite a short space of time since they've, again, arisen into public discourse. Their history is a little difficult to figure out, but what I've managed to piece together by reviewing their Facebook group, their Instagram account, and their Twitter/X account seems to me like things really started in 2021. Around that time, the Facebook group was created at that time, and whoever runs it at that time, again, it's all kind of murky, started putting out branded messages, protest letters, letters to the board, social media things to share. In spring 2023, so there's a bit of a gap, in terms of what I can figure out. I'm not a journalist, I'm not a historian, I'm just an idiot with too much time in his hands. They started organizing or at least amplifying some of the rally marches that were taking place around Tottenham Hotspur in spring of 2023, including supporting a boycott of the stadium facilities for men's and women's matches around that time. Again, a bit of a time skip. I think they were still active in the interim, but in December 2024, it looks like their activities really began to ramp up with A4 signs, Levy out signs that they were making available for distribution, calls for boycotts, and they were also responsible, or at least part of the balloons that were released at the Liverpool game in December 2024, which had Levy or ENIC out on them. Their live streams on X and Twitter began in 23-25 in February, and they also began appearing on across some very popular podcasts like The Fighting Cock, Last Word on Spurs back in last year, I guess, Last Word on Spurs. And these Twitter spaces became a weekly or bi-weekly occurrence from there on. Their first protest was in February 2025 for the Man United game, where they had thousands of people and received a tremendous amount of media attention. I think Sky Sports News, the Evening Standard, the Athletic, everyone was writing about them. Their second protest took place in early April for the Southampton game and had at least similar numbers. So there's some sustained interest in protesting what they perceive to be the failures and incompetencies at the head of Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, and the failure to capitalize on the financial successes that we've had and put it into place as silverware, which I think most fans can empathize with. They do have another protest planned. This is going to be an ongoing thing that Spurs fans are going to have to, I don't know, not necessarily make a decision on, but are going to have to integrate into their thinking somewhat. The next protest is for the Palace game later this season. In the time from their explosion and activity in December 2024 to now, their X account has grown from 7,000 followers to 17,000, plus more people on Facebook and Instagram. I'm sad to say that they don't have a presence on Blue Sky yet. Maybe that's because of the number of people that's on Blue Sky relative to these other places. Maybe it's because, if I'm honest, Blue Sky does tend to skew more towards ENIC sympathy than Twitter. And so for this review that I'm going to be talking about in a moment, I tried to listen to the live streams that were available on YouTube. They're at Change For Spurs in most places, as well as a few spaces on X/Twitter that were exclusive to that site. So what does Change For Tottenham want? I haven't even talked about that yet. They want the removal of ENIC and or Daniel Levy from the Spurs leadership hierarchy. They're also interested in smaller victories that can arise from the sustained pressure that they can place on the club related to spending on the team, financial transfers, wages, things like that, as well as greater fan engagement and involvement in club decisions. These are a fan-forward movement. And when they say fans, they're primarily talking about local fans or match-going fans. They want to achieve these goals in the form of fan action, predominantly rallies and marches, so visible protests, some selective lobbying of board members via email, which seems to be not necessarily a targeted campaign or coordinated campaign so much as the Spurs Change For Tottenham team themselves emailing the club. They're conducting fan surveys. They have one that's happening right now about the atmosphere at the lane. And I'd say that their biggest thing that they've managed to do is get media attention to their movement. There are some off-limits topics. They've mentioned numerous times in their live streams that they won't entertain the idea of an economic boycott under their name, which is interesting because, as I mentioned earlier, it did seem like they were supporting facilities boycotts, so spending at the stadium. They must have had some advice or come to the conclusion that that isn't going to be sustainable, at least in the near future. Similarly, they are against no-shows and walkouts, so anything that involves fans not being in the stadium for a game. And both of these speak to the values of Change For Tottenham and their leadership team. They don't want to be forcing people into making a choice that lessens their experience of the game. They've rightly pointed out that people spend a lot of money to go to the stadium, and they don't want to be telling them what they can or cannot do with their money. or what a child can spend at the stadium. So they're trying to be consistent in their messaging, I'd say, with these values. Sometimes they waver from them when there's a fan question in one of their Q&As, but mostly they're pretty consistent about what they won't do. And I'll loop back to these areas later. There are some key figures. As I mentioned, there is a leadership group. They get talked about a little bit on the live streams. It's been difficult for me to track down their names. I've been able to find a list of Twitter handles or accounts, but I can't verify who's behind those accounts necessarily, or anything about them. In terms of I'm going to walk that back. There are accounts available, and with enough effort, you could go and figure out who these people are, what they stand for, their history. But their website lacks information about the leadership group, who they are, their names, their faces, and I find that interesting. On the live streams themselves, there are some key figures. Dan seems to be the main figure in CFT, as far as I can tell. He hosts most of the live streams, and he does a good job. He's a nice guy. He seems approachable and is a natural conversationalist. He's joined often by Chris. She's his co-host and has appeared on Last Word on Spurs. Billy T, who adds some much-needed social media clout, I'd say. And makes numerous appearances across other podcasts, including Hometown Glory, Dr. Tottenham, The Fighting Cock, as he appears on This Week. Who else? Oh, there we go. Heidi is another name that crops up. She runs the social media account, and has come on to talk about some of their commonly asked questions. And there might be another Billy who appears, but as you can gather, there's no sort of surnames on these people. There's no information about who they are, and I find that vagueness and lack of transparency a little concerning as somebody who values that in protest groups. They are joined by numerous guests, and they've made guest appearances in various other places. Most notably, the infamous social media ITK/commentator and football agent Paul O'Keefe has appeared on a dedicated live stream. He had about 3,000 people tune in to that on Twitter/X. Cat Law and Martin Cloak, former Tottenham Hotspur Supporters Trust chairs, who are still involved in fan advocacy movements via the Save Our Seniors campaign, have also appeared. I like Cat and Martin. I like listening to them. I think their history of advocacy and dedication to Tottenham history is highly laudable and something that I enjoy. Ricky Sachs, I believe, of Last Word on Spurs and other popular podcasters have tuned into some of their spaces, but it's difficult to track down where that might have been. Themselves, the members of the CFT leadership team have appeared on Last Word on Spurs, The Fighting Cock, Chris Cowlin, Radio London, Evening Standard, and more. Something interesting that I interpret in terms of the guests that they've brought in, they bring credibility to the movement. These are people that supporters online are very familiar with, some name recognition, some clout. And they're also reinforcing CFT's messages around the club's perceived failures, incompetence, and greed in different ways. And they bring different qualities. So contrast Paul O'Keefe, whose appearance on a live stream really, I felt, appealed more to the emotional side of the Levy out, Enoch out movement, talking about transfer mishaps, missed opportunities, things like that. Whereas Cat and Martin's two appearances, which if you were to tune into any of the live streams, I'd recommend tuning into the two with Cat and Martin. And their experiences of being in boardrooms with Daniel Levy and their story after story of relationship and communication problems with Tottenham Hotspur Football Club really appeals to the more rational fan, I feel. So they're all bringing something different to the table, and it's going to be interesting over time to see if they can keep that diversity going on the Change For Tottenham live streams. So the live streams themselves, they're hosted on YouTube at the moment, but they take place primarily, as far as I can tell, on X/Twitter Spaces and Instagram Live. Most of them are about an hour. Spaces as a platform is kind of limited in my opinion, but it does have some advantages. I feel like at the moment the group is still in its infancy, and being in this more enclosed, limited platform creates an in-group or exclusive mentality for people. You know, you're part of a secret club almost. And I feel like that's fine for early buy-in and growth, but I suspect that they know that they need to expand beyond the boundaries of X spaces, hence the mirroring of their content on YouTube. Most of these streams can be classified as sort of fireside chats when a guest is involved with some Q&A, or they're just town halls with a heavy question and answer component. They're generally speaking a little rough around the edges. You know, when callers call in, they've got, you know, various audio qualities. Sometimes a dog is snoring in the background. Sometimes you hear somebody, you know, lighting a cigarette. But I feel like all of this sort of DIY mentality that almost comes across in their calls and in their streams contrasts with their complaints about the stale corporate communications that they receive from Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, the club itself. This is, I feel, endearing to some. There is a direct connection to people, especially in the case of the Q&As. Having a voice for these people to come on is good, and all of this engagement is all supporting their drive to get people to attend marches and rallies in person at the stadium, because that's where their primary focus is. All of these live streams are about getting people to the marches and protests, and that's fine. And again, over time, it's going to be interesting to see if they have to be more dynamic with what they do. One downside of the live streams is that obviously at the moment things kind of suck to be a Spurs fan, at least on the field. So whenever the talk of the current form of the team is mentioned, it's often connected back to previous failures of the boardroom, which makes sense, but it can be a little bit messy for their messaging. You know, are their concerns rooted in the present or in the past? And so, you know, they're linked, and that's understandable. And they can't constantly just be talking about rallies and what things they can do for their marches. But like I said, it could be a little confusing. In terms of their fan feedback, the CFT people are really emphasizing that everything they do is about getting all fans behind them and their push to remove Enoch and Levy from the club. And everything they do is, at least how they want to talk about it, is highly collaborative. And for that, these Q&As are quite nice. You can hear the CFT leadership thought process in real time when new ideas and information is presented to them, and as they try to integrate them into their existing values and approaches. They've had to repeatedly clarify those ideas and suggestions which are in opposition to their values. I mentioned them earlier, things like economic boycotts, no-shows, walkouts. And so to get a sort of feel for what people are asking of them, I did an analysis of a post on X/Twitter recently where they solicited for ideas for future protests from their followers. And I'll post the full analysis to my Blue Sky account. So 17 people wanted an attendance boycott. 16 people wanted an economic boycott. Again, this is in direct opposition to what Change For Tottenham have repeatedly said they'll do. 23 people supported in-stadium actions. Again, this is something that Change For Tottenham has repeatedly said they don't think will work. 24 people want something outside the stadium or even beyond. There was mention of going to the training ground, turning up at Beyonce concerts, which was echoed in a live stream. I think it was either Kat and Martin or the Paul O'Keefe live stream, where they mentioned potentially protesting Beyonce. Well, not protesting Beyonce, the Queen. No, protesting at the Beyonce concert that's coming up soon. Or even turning up to Daniel Levy's house was mentioned, which could be tongue-in-cheek, but I don't believe it was. And then 4 people also mentioned they would be behind some sort of online campaign, which again has been dismissed. And I feel like this is a missed opportunity regarding the inclusion of international fans. So there's quite the diversity of suggestions coming their way, in addition to rallies, banners, stuff like that. And we're going to have to pay attention to how they navigate these demands on their approach. So I've talked about, these live streams and their qualities, and I've tried to remain positive, but I do have some concerns about their approach. And all of this is intended to be constructive criticism. I'm like, it really matters. I'm a guy with a few hundred followers talking into a microphone who has no experience in this matter, has no experience running, huge fan protest movements. But these are the things that I've heard and I felt were missing, or I would like to see addressed in the future if I had a magic wand. One thing that I find a little concerning is a frequent citation of a split of their support, or the Tottenham Hotspur support in general. They call it a 20-60-20. 20% people completely support them. 20% of people are completely against them. And there are 60% of people who are on the fence. And those are the people they want to target. I could nitpick the numbers. I could complain about that. I could, ask whether or not these are in-stadium fans or worldwide fans. But what really concerns me is it feels like they only really want to have a dialogue with 80% of the fan base, and the remaining 20% of people who don't really want Levy to go anywhere are left to their own devices. And I don't know. It just doesn't quite sit right with me. Something about it feels uncomfortable. Maybe because I'm somewhere in that 60 leading towards the 20% who don't agree with them. In terms of transparency, I mentioned earlier that it was kind of hard to figure out who is behind Change for Tottenham, especially, you just can't if you don't have an X or a Twitter account. I'd like to see more transparency behind the leadership team on their website. They've got some great goals with the flags that they're selling. They've tried to sell them cheap, but have a portion of the funds go to a few charities, which is all just, I think, a tremendously good idea. I do wish that was opt-in, but I understand why in terms of complicating the sales that they don't. But they haven't mentioned how much from each flag is going to go to the Tottenham Hotspur Food Bank, and I think it's the Noah's Ark Hospice, I want to say. Forgive me if I've got that wrong. Again, I think it's great that they're going to put money towards that, but they haven't said how much of the sale of each flag is going to go to these two worthy causes, how they're storing that money, how they're managing that money, when that money is going to be paid. And so that's all just kind of concerning. And one other thing on transparency I'd like to see is a record of their meeting minutes. There must be something happening behind the scenes and conversations they're having. I'd like to see this documented and at least in some kind of abridged form be available for review. Another nitpick I guess I have is whether this is local or international focused. The name is the giveaway, right? It's Change for Tottenham, not Change for Spurs, although their social media accounts are Change for Spurs. But regardless, the name of the movement is Change for Tottenham, as in Tottenham the area, as in the people around Tottenham, the people who can go to matches themselves, can attend marches. The live streams, their messaging is all about getting people to attend marches, which are highly visible, and they've said time and again is, what gets media attention. Their banners get media attention. And so I do feel that other fans who can't engage in those activities, of which there are hundreds of millions of Spurs fans, are treated to a little bit like online cheerleaders. They're relegated to that, buy a flag, take a photograph at your, pub in Dallas, Texas, wherever, right? And I feel like there could be more of an effort to think about how to engage them and bring them in, because there is international support for Daniel Levy and ENIC leaving the club. And if they can tap into that, I think they're really onto something, because that's where the money is. And it's going to be intriguing to see how they target their messaging around the tour in Hong Kong and Asia this summer. And then finally, in terms of concerns, there are some unspoken topics that I wish were addressed by the Change for Tottenham people. The women's team never gets mentioned. This is generally a critique of all narratives around the club. It's always the men, never what this means for the women. The hypocrisy from the club on environmental and social matters was brought up by somebody in one of the Q&As, and I think that's really important. That would be a good rallying point for an even more diverse portion of the fan base. And to also engage their critics and criticisms that may come their way. I mentioned the 20-60-20 split. I think this is part of it. You know, I want to hear how concerns of mine and people like me are going to be addressed instead of just kind of forgotten about. And just in general, I want to hear more hope from the Change for Tottenham people. You know, this is a topic born out of frustration and anger, I guess. But I need to hear a little bit of hope for how this is going to improve things. You know, it's implied that things are going to get better. But I feel like there should be some joy that can be found in this movement. I think making the marches a joyful place would be a good start. They're already family friendly from what they tell us. Making them a party atmosphere would be part of that. So yeah, I want to hear some joy in this, and maybe that'll come as they get some wins. I'm not sure, but I don't know how sustainable kind of constant negativity might be. And again, all that negativity is understandable, but it can be draining, and it's going to be hard to maintain that voice when things get better for Spurs. So, you know, my conclusions, I think they're a savvy outfit. They've managed to influence the Spurs narrative and zeitgeist in a way that we haven't seen for a while. Maybe they've capitalized on what's been a crap season, but by keeping a DIY feel to their movement, by not being too slick, but by clearly thinking things out, they've managed to engage fans and really capture a moment. I think that's really interesting, really cool. Good for them. You know, they found that people want to be heard, and they're tapping into that in their live streams. The guests that they're bringing in are giving them some credibility, some diversity of thought, but the gaps in messaging that I mentioned earlier, I mean, maybe all this makes sense when viewed through the lens of just getting people to show up to marches and rallies at men's games, you know. It'd be interesting to see what they consider to be success in the long term. A new CEO has just been announced at Tottenham. Would changing the manager, changing the recruitment system be part of it if Daniel Levy's still in place? I don't know. What about new owners? You know, what if the new owners are also awful? Are they going to stick around? Like, these are things that I'm going to be keeping an eye on. So how do I feel? You know, what does Iain think? I don't necessarily like the implicit assumption that change is good. It's not one that I share. I do value that Tottenham are owned and led by Brits, although overseas, you know, now. And Daniel Levy has expressed himself as a fan. He may not be the same type of fan as me, but there are lots of fans who aren't like me. I do value the long-term stability that's been provided by ENIC. I recognize the improvements they've made, the gambles that haven't paid off, such as regulations, certain player acquisitions. And I am concerned about who comes after Daniel Levy, who comes after ENIC, and what they want out of Tottenham Hotspur. But I do want some of the same things as Change for Tottenham. I want better communication with the fans. I want much greater fan involvement in club activities and decisions. I want greater support for seniors and children. These are the past and the future of our great supporter base. And if you rip them out, I don't know what Spurs looks like. Ticket prices are too high. They're just too damn high. And I want to see a much more effective football strategy. Because I think that we are yo-yoing, or whatever you want to call it, every 18 months with managers, and we seem to be constantly changing our philosophy. So that's Change for Tottenham. I hope that it was a good listen. I'm going to sign off, so thank you for your support. Please keep sharing and subscribing the podcast. Follow me on Blue Sky at PoddenhamPodspur. Email me at poddenhampodspur@gmail.com. And keep making and listening to Tottenham Hotspur podcasts. Bye.